Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the after show. I'm solo tonight. No co-host, given the fact that I was outside of my house when I heard about the issuance of this order from our source and had to spend a lot of time not only understanding what our legal rights to report it were, but also making decisions about the level of risk to which we were subjecting ourselves and how to minimize that while still doing the reporting. I felt like it needed to be done, and I had no time to go home and pick up any dogs. So let's get to the questions. Glenn heard there were a ton of arrests and some really bad things happening to people, including children in Brazil right now. Can you confirm this? I'm not entirely sure what that means. There were certainly a lot of arrests on Sunday when thousands of Bolsonaro supporters descended upon Brasilia, invaded the three branches of power, basically, the presidential palace, the Supreme Court, and the Congress, broke in, did a lot of property damage to artwork and furniture and the buildings themselves. And among them were children, because people went as a family to protest. I think it had a lot of similarities to January 6th in the limited sense I mean here, that some people went expecting there to be violence. Other people went expecting there to be something greater than violence. And then other people just went expecting to exercise their democratic rights to participate in a protest and had no idea that it was going to turn into something illegal or violent. And so some people took their kids. I think what ended up happening was kind of anybody in the vicinity of those buildings who seemed as though they were there to support the cause ended up being swept up in the arrests. So I don't want to either affirm or deny some of the reports about the abusive conditions in which people were being held, whether children were part of that. I will say that Brazil's notorious for having a very kind of abusive prison system. The conditions in which people are imprisoned, often for years without a trial, are horrendous. They're notoriously overcrowded. And so usually that doesn't get much attention because the people who are kept in those prisons are primarily black and poor people from the nation's favelas. And no one cares that they're subjected to abusive prison conditions, often without being convicted of crimes or with very trivial charges against them. And then, of course, once a different sort of person ends up in the Brazilian prison system, they start saying, wow, this is terrible. We're being treated very poorly. So it's hard to know how much of it is the fact that the people who were arrested are middle class, white, people who don't expect themselves to be the kinds of people who end up in prison. Although it was a more diverse set of protests than that. I don't mean to suggest it was all white or anything. I'm just saying we've seen this disparity before where sort of the invisible population is kept in horrific conditions in prisons unjustly, and no one cares. And then once the profile of the person complaining changes, suddenly people start paying attention. So, I think that was true with the January 6th defendants. They were kept in terrible conditions for many months without bail. There was political persecutions. I had a lot of, opposition to that. But at the same time, that's pretty common in the American prison system, which imprisons more people in the world than any other country. Thing is, what is happening in Brazil is happening in the US, just a little more subtle. Totally agree. Could not agree more with that. In fact, instead of having this kind of overt censorship order from a judge who tried to keep it secret, but sometimes it gets publicized, what instead happens is, as we've seen from the Twitter files, there's all kinds of pressure exerted by the government onto big tech to pressure in accordance with the government's orders. So the effect is the same. People whom the government doesn't want being heard end up censored. It's just not quite as overt. What can we do for Monarch here, meaning the guest whom I just interviewed? He is doing well on Rumble. He was able to take a big part of his audience with him. He's able to earn a living as a result of finding a place on Rumble. I played a role in that. I encouraged Rumble to give him a home because I thought what was done to him was so incredibly unjust. And again, it wasn't just that he was censored, it was that his reputation was destroyed based on a lie, that he was a defender of Nazism, when the only thing he said was, I believe the state should not be able to ban political parties. And when asked by his guests, does that include the Nazi Party? He said, yes. He said, you should be able to dislike Jews, or you should be able to dislike groups, even though those views are bad. The government shouldn't be able to make it illegal for you to do that. He was just defending the American system of free speech. And if you want to say that that is an argument that's wrong or bad, have at it. But to claim that he was defending Nazism itself, that he himself was a Nazi, wasn't just unfair. It was an absolute lie. So he found a home on Rumble. He's able to make a living, and that's why I think this order is a concern, because now they're purposely reaching out to Rumble. They know that Rumble is now a refuge for people who are being banned on other big tech platforms, and it's now on their radar. And even though Rumble has nothing to do with Brazil other than hosting Brazilian voices, they're now reaching out to Rumble and threatening Rumble that if you don't censor the people we want censored, we're going to start fining and punishing you. My guess is, even if Rumble ignores the order and the Brazilian government has no way to fine Rumble since they don't have bank accounts in Brazil, they may start doing things like what they did with WhatsApp or Telegram, threatening to ban the entire platform in Brazil, which would make people in Brazil, for example, not able to see my show and any other show on Rumble, the way that Rumble is now no longer in France because of their unwillingness to obey French censorship orders. So we'll see how that plays out. Question, how is de Moraes even going to collect from these foreign companies if they don't comply? Exactly. I think when it comes to Facebook and Google and these much larger international companies, you probably can do that. There's a big presence of Facebook and Google and Twitter in Brazil, or at least there was Twitter in Brazil until Elon Musk fired pretty much everybody in Brazil. I think there's 8 employees left. But Facebook and Google have big presences, physical presences. They have a lot of employees, therefore they have a lot of bank accounts, a lot of legal entities, so that you could go after those Brazilian entities and collect that way. Rumble, I think, is much, much more difficult to enforce those orders against. And that's why I say I don't know what Rumble's posture is. So far, we checked again, Monarch's channel is up on Rumble, so Rumble has not complied with that order. Whether they do or don't is up to them, but I hope they don't. The way they refuse to obey the French censorship order just on principle. But like I said, I don't think if the Brazilian Supreme Court sees Rumble disobeying them, they're just going to say, oh, too bad, I guess there's nothing we can do. My guess is they're going to try then and ban Rumble as a platform from being heard in Brazil at all. I think that's the extreme lengths to which they're willing to go. So if I'm understanding this right, Moraes did not ban Glenn yet because of his reporting freeing Lula from prison on his political side. No, you do not have that right. Alessandro de Moraes is not really a leftist at all. In fact, as I said, he was a supporter of Judge Moro, the judge who was at the center of our reporting. Judge de Moraes was part of the government that impeached the Workers' Party, Lula's Workers' Party, and replaced them despite not really having any legitimacy. That's why I say Alessandro de Moraes was hated by the left for years. They did not consider him a political ally. It's sort of like in the U.S., the way liberals now love Bill Kristol and neocons, just simply because they're on his side, they're on their side when it comes to Trump. The Brazilian left loves de Moraes only because he views Bolsonaro as a threat and has been attacking the civil liberties of his supporters. So to the extent Moraes hasn't come after me yet, it's not because I did reporting that is on his side. He liked Lava Jato, which was the anti-corruption probe that we proved to be corrupt. I'm sure he disliked my reporting at the time. I think the majority of the Supreme Court believed I had the right to do it, but I don't think de Moraes regards me at all as on his side politically. I think the problem for them is that given that I have an international platform and a certain kind of stature as a journalist, I think it would be a lot more difficult in terms of repercussions and media impact for them to, for example, try and censor my show off Rumble, or in some other way try and censor me off social media. That doesn't mean they won't do it. They put Lula in prison, after all, who was the president of this country for 8 years. They have Julian Assange in prison. So even though there's negative media repercussions to things, doesn't mean governments aren't willing to undertake those costs if they feel it's necessary enough. I think at least as of now, Dima Reich hasn't considered it worth it to target me. I just escalated pretty severely my criticisms of him. Both earlier this week I did, when it became a big deal in Brazil. My name is currently the second most trending topic on Brazilian Twitter. There's the revelation of this order and my criticisms of it. The fact that Elon Musk became interested in it is a big, big deal in Brazil. I'm clearly much more on their radar now than I was before. So whether that changes the calculus for them, it remains to be seen. But that's certainly the reason why I had to think twice and a third time about how far I wanted to go. And then, I knew that I would ultimately come to the conclusion that the day that I refrain from doing journalism that I think is necessary or expressing critiques that I think are valid out of fear of what will be done to me by government authorities is the day that I should stop being a journalist. I mean, if you're not willing to undertake those risks, I don't think you have any business being in journalism. And like I said, I do think I have a platform that's less vulnerable to these kind of attacks than a lot of other people. So if I'm not willing to do this, who would be? Last questions. Who are these Brazilian authorities mentioned in the New York Times article who bestowed overarching authority on Dima Reich? Is the position for life? Does Lula have the power to do anything about it? So just like in the U.S., Supreme Court appointments in Brazil are lifetime appointments. I think there's a mandatory retirement age. Maybe someone in the control room can tell me. I think it's 75. Is that right? Yeah, I think there's a mandatory retirement age. But other than that, it's a lifetime appointment in the sense that you're not just appointed for a specific term. You can be removed, I believe. You can be impeached, but only under very narrow circumstances, like in the United States, for corruption, bribery, things of that nature. The New York Times article was basically pointing to the fact that Dima Reich, not necessarily in every instance, but with the overall regime created, has the backing of the majority of the Supreme Court. If he didn't, the Supreme Court, when a justice acts alone, has the right to review the decision as a court and can overturn that individual's ruling. So the fact that they have not yet done so in any of these cases, including the most controversial ones, strongly suggests that the majority of the court supports him. And in regard to the decision I mentioned where he suspended for 90 days the elected government of the federal district on grounds that he was either deliberately careless and failing to provide security or even complicit in those attacks on government buildings, the majority of the court did weigh in officially and endorse his decision. So I think politically, if not legally, he has their backing. Despite your lawyer's reassurances, do you really feel you are safe? I do not. Remember, it was only 2 years ago that the Brazilian government actually did bring charges against me. They indicted me with 26 felony charges that had a combined total of 326 years in prison. And ironically, it was the Brazilian Supreme Court that intervened and protected me. They had issued a ruling that Brazil's constitution guarantees a free press, and that free press guarantee applied to the work that I was doing as a journalist, which in turn banned the government from punishing me for that reporting. So when Brazilian prosecutors, who were very closely allied to the judge, who was by then Bolsonaro's justice minister, brought those charges against me, the judge in Brasilia who got the case, and it works a little differently in Brasilia, where in the United States, the government has the right to indict you. So the minute that they charge you with a crime, you're considered indicted. And then the judge gets assigned to your case and decides whether you're guilty or innocent. In Brazil, there's kind of an extra step. The prosecutors charge you with crimes, but before you're fully officially charged, the court has to accept the charges as valid. And in 99% of the cases they do, it's just a formality. But in my case, my lawyers, the minute I was charged, went into that court and said that given this prior Supreme Court ruling protecting me from retaliation based on the constitutional right of free press that I have, these charges are invalid, in conflict with the Supreme Court's ruling. And the judge in the case who, remember, my co-defendants were the people who they alleged were my sources, the people that actually hacked the material that were provided to me. They claimed I became a co-conspirator. The judge who was assigned to that case, in the part of the ruling where he dismissed the charges against me, rejected them, made very clear that he believes I actually did engage in conduct that could be considered criminal, and that he wishes he could have accepted that indictment, but that his hands were tied because the Supreme Court, to which he's obviously subordinate, had previously ruled that I couldn't be retaliated against, and even invited the Supreme Court to reconsider whether my conduct fell within the purview of those constitutional rights. So not only in some technical sense do I continue to depend on the Brazilian Supreme Court for my freedom, since that decision was, the decision to reject the charges against me was appealed by the government, and it's presumably somewhere in the court system. But, you know, as the New York Times article said, there are almost no limits on this judge's power. And politically, he's become extremely popular among the media and the Brazilian left. They're united in support of him. So unlike in 2019 and 2020, when my reporting was very popular among the Brazilian left and among some sectors of the Brazilian media, politically, I think I would have most people against me and on the side of this judge, because the consensus in Brazil right now is that the Bolsonaro movement is so dangerous, sort of like Al-Qaeda was to the United States, that a certain form of authoritarianism is almost necessary to protect the country's democracy. And so I'm not particularly confident in what would happen if, you know, he ordered me censored from the internet, even if there were charges brought. But, you know, like I said, at the end of the day, if these are not risks you're willing to take as a journalist, you should leave the profession. As to the part of the question about Lula, does he have the authority to do anything about it? Not really. Lula is not the one who appointed this judge. As I said, the judge was appointed by the government, the president, Michel Temer, that the Brazilian left, including Lula, considered to be an illegitimate coup government. A coup government, they felt that the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, Lula's successor, was a form of a coup. So Lula didn't put him on the court. And just like in the United States, there's a separation of powers. You know, just like the president doesn't have the power to overturn a Supreme Court ruling, Lula as president doesn't really have much power when it came to the court. That's the reason why the Supreme Court was one of the most effective tools against Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro had very little power when it came to the court. Like in the US, Bolsonaro can censor law or veto laws enacted by Congress. He had a lot of allies in Congress. He could, you know, kind of negotiate and trade. He could control the Congress a lot more than you can control the court. The court's basically uncontrollable. There are some checks. Again, Congress can impeach judges and the like, but, you know, no, I think both politically and legally, there are very few limits on this judge's power. The one check is just like in the United States, where the Senate has to confirm a judge to be appointed to the court. Both houses of Congress have to confirm the appointment of the judge by the president to the court. So that's the check. And then they have the impeachment power, but only in the most extreme cases. So there's some checks in theory, but very little in practice. So I have to say, you know, this was a lot of work tonight. It was a lot of energy. There was a lot of stress. I think we ended up at some point with in excess of 50,000 people watching live. So it made a big impact. As I said, my name is the #2 trending topic in Brazil. I've now been #1. I skipped over some big volleyball tournament that people are interested in. I have a feeling that not all of the commentary is positive. I have a pretty good feeling that that's the case. So, you know, we knew we were getting into a pretty big fight. The problem is we didn't have much time to kind of contemplate it. I think I learned about this order maybe 3 or 4 p.m. Eastern time, so maybe 3 hours before the show was going live and about to start. Didn't give us a lot of preparation time, a lot of time to contemplate. It gave me enough time to be confident in what I was reporting about the order. I spoke to experts in the judicial system and some other sources. I knew the order was authentic. I felt comfortable enough with what my lawyers told me. but it was definitely a risk, but I think it was a risk worth taking. So that's going to conclude our show for the evening. I think everybody here is a little bit tired. Happy to have the weekend in front of us. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us on the after show.